going to be a little loose with the topic, though, and we're just going to go where we arrived last time and continue from there. So the theme for today's conversation is something I call deep narratology. And if you're familiar with the work from Pross and Event, you know that narratology is an innovation that John Söderqvist and I made. And with narratology, we explain why philosophy is always separated ontology, phenomenology, and epistemology into three different realms. It's simply because human beings have three different ways of approaching the truth and three different ways of addressing narrative. So there are three different meta-narratives. One of the obvious one is logos, which is the factual truth, which is always in the past. What actually happened? What are the facts about reality? And then we have the pathos, which is for us human beings incredibly important because we're emotional beings. We're emotional more than anything else. We think through our emotions. We don't actually calculate on zeros and ones. Believe it or not, we don't. Human beings have emotions all the way through, but our emotions make us feel that we think. And therefore, pathos is incredibly important. And the forces that reign inside of us that we're not in control of and that pop up all the time, seismologically and cause volcanic eruptions in our lives. These forces, for example, sexuality and violence, are pathic forces. And the stories about sex and violence are the pathic narratives. For example, the news feed, the pornographic movie, or say a snuff movie. The violence, which is real, it's actually happening here and now. All those things are pathic narratives. And then we have the third category, which is the mix of the other two, which is the mythos. And the mythos is simply the way we try to make sense of the world, for example, through a theater play. If I give a speech to somebody who turns 50 years old, I don't just tell them the facts about their past lives. This is what happened in your life all the way up to you're 50, because then somebody will come up and, kick my ass because I'm just a boring speaker and I don't feel any love or devotion towards the 50-year-old at all. They don't feel any connection. So I make up something. I could even add hyperbole to my speech, but I go theatrical, to put it that way. And that truth is sometimes more true than the facts. So when we human beings approach truth, what we get out of mythos is that because it has an emotional element added to it, not just the strict facts, therefore mythos often feels more true to us than anything else. And in reality, if we start looking at Nietzsche's worldview, Nietzsche was the one who claimed that truth ultimately is always a mythos, because the only way for pathos and logos to find any unification is through mythos. So therefore, we perceive the world not as if the world was relativistic, but we have to understand the world is relativistic. Otherwise, we can't comprehend the world at all. It's the only sincere, honest way of approaching the world is through relativism. But this is Nietzsche's point. The way we do that in our work is that we add Freud to it, and with narratology, we sexualize narratology, and we basically say, Ian McGilchrist's version of the world of the split brain is basically the masculine brain. He talks about himself. He's an Englishman who talks about himself. And therefore, the logos and the pathos can never find unity. So the logos and the pathos can only find unity temporarily through the mythos. And that's what woman represents. So woman represents unity, wholeness, and therefore she's mythologized by men and therefore sexually attractive. Whereas women find men exciting because men are the separation of logos and pathos. They can never find unity between the two. They're constantly struggling between the two brain house. And therefore, instead, woman finds it hard to separate fact from fiction, which she assumes that men can do. And therefore, women mix up fact and fiction constantly because they're in a more mythical state. And because of that mythical state, they're sexually attractive to men, but also they need men in their lives. So that means, for example, René Girard is a thinker who's actually talking about the feminine brain. And therefore, the lynch mob, which Girard is obsessed with, and scapegoating mechanisms and all those things, are actually the feminine half of society. So by laying that out, we created narratology, and John and I did that in Pross and Event. Now we're going to go into the deep narratology. I'm going to talk with you guys about later tonight and go into an interactive discussion, because this is where we're heading for the planned Zufism book. So what do you mean by that? Well, this is consequences for philosophy, because it means that ontology and phenomenology and epistemology cannot be reduced to one another, because essentially phenomenology is dealing with pathos. Ontology is dealing with the logos. That's why the zeros and ones are located in the logos. And that means epistemology, how we human beings get to know the world and engage with the world directly in the present now, is on the feminine side, and it's epistemology. And what Hegel does is that he unites ontology and epistemology by making them move with each other. So he creates a dance between the logos and the mythos. We talked about that last week. I had a discussion, for example, with Owen at the end of the evening about that mix. But when we go to art, for example, art completely forgets about the logos, can ignore it entirely, and therefore goes into realm between the mythos and the pathos, which to me is a possibility for unity that's never been done in philosophy, and we're going to work towards it in the Sufism book because we can be united. We already know that ontology and phenomenology can never be united. Not at all. They're too far from each other. They're totally reducible to each other. We know it from the masculine brain. You can never unite the logos and the pathos. It's just the way the world works. Continuity cannot be united with discretion. A little child can sit with a square and a circle and have fun at the fact they can never be united. You can never push one of them into the other. It won't work. And this is fundamentally our logos and pathos are not united, because the pathos is in the side of the circle and logos is the side of the square. So what does this mean? Well, we have another theory in process, which is the VPA theory. And VPA theory is a theory about the time axis and how we human beings relate to the time axis. And what I've discussed on the Intellectual Deep Web over the last 6 months, and a lot of people know that I'm doing that, is that it's also possible to use VPA theory, which is another triad, but a triad along the time axis, to study consciousness. And this is what I told you last week, that I wanted the second session to be about time and consciousness. And you're going to understand eventually as we go along that this also is the difference between the exoteric and the esoteric. Okay, so let's go into that. Let's go into deep narratology, and let's put deep narratology along the divine time axis. So what happens if we then try to unify narratology, which is a triad, it could very likely then be responded to with the other triad, which is VPA theory. So VPA theory, we're dealing with existence itself. And it's totally overrated, because existence only exists in the now, and the now, in the now, in the now. Before the now, nothing exists. After the now, nothing exists. Existence only exists itself within the now. Graham Priest has written about this already, so I'm going to borrow 3 terms from him to understand what that means. It's called presentism in philosophy. In the history of philosophy, it's called presentism. So either you're an eternalist, you equal the past and the now and the future into one unity, and then you create block universes like Albert Einstein do. To me, that's absolute madness. That's absolute madness, because the world consists of births and deaths. And this is why the birth and the death, what's in between the birth and the death, is the now, is the present. So a present moment, a momentum, is when the future dies and the past is born. And the future dies and the past is born. And according to Hegel, also somebody who's inspired Graham Priest a lot, that means that the indeterminate dies and becomes the determinate in the present. And we can describe time itself and the experience of time as exactly that. The indeterminate meaning I have freedom to affect the world and be engaged with the world in the now. I can plan for it. I can have ideas and fantasies about the future while I'm in the future. Sure, I can take them for the future, but it's in the now when I have to interact with the world. I have that moment when I interact with the world. Action only happens in the now. Everything exists in the now. And instead of presentism, which to me is kind of a misused word, and I don't want to defend a lot of bad philosophy in the name of presentism, I will propose to use a new term. Yeah, of course, I got it on a ketamine trip. I call it momentalism. Momentalism. It sounds great, doesn't it? Like almost like monumentalism, although it isn't. But momentalism is to really put the momentum at the top of things, to really put the present at the top of things. If you studied Whitehead, if you studied David Bohm, you're familiar with philosophers who've done work like this before. They're kind of proto-momentalists. So let's see if you can go all the way to be complete momentalists. To be momentalist is to believe that the only thing that ever exists is the now and the present. And as soon as the present is over, it's dead. And it's resorted to the past. And the past we can't do anything about. The past is what Nietzsche calls amor fati. It's what Hegel calls the determinate. This is where Hegel and Nietzsche are completely unified. They're both momentalist or proto-momentalist. So if you go to that state and everything is over and done with, that means that the whole question of birth and death has to be reduced to questions of presence. And as I've told you before, presence is on the side of the feminine. That's why if a man and a woman go on a date, then the woman often have the strongest little moment she has during the date is when she tells the guy, I don't feel that you're really present with me. And of course, the smart guy should answer that, well, I'm a man, I'm stupid. I can't be present. That's why I'm dating you. Presence is your weapon. Presence is your asset. Presence is what I love about you, because I'm both in the past and I'm both in the future. I'm both in the logos, which is the past. I'm both in the pathos, which is the future, to try to protect you, to try to provide for you, because I'm too busy with it. I can't really be present. That's exactly what I want to fuck you. So the state of presence is where things exist, or existence is. So the question is then, and Graham Priest developed this, is that then we need other terms to be honest about this. If you go esoteric here, for example, if you're honest about it, we need other terms to understand future and past, because future and past are something we play around with constantly in our mind, even if we're totally preoccupied with the present. And we can never be outside of the present. Everything occurs in the present. Okay? So prior to existence, in this sense, the future is what Graham Priest cleverly calls absistence. It's not existence, it's absistence. So the future absists. Ab as in absence. It's not there yet. It's the fantasy about something that isn't there, but could potentially happen. And when our minds go off and fantasize about the future, and not the potential of the future, because the potential is in the present, but virtual. When the mind virtualizes, when the mind comes up with different possibilities of the future, and the mind can either have wonderful, beautiful fantasies that he wants to fulfill in his life, falling in love with somebody, go out through the door, you know, they have $1 billion dropped on my head or whatever, and finally the stock exchange went up after 3 dreadful weeks of going down. Anything good news out there, we can fantasize about that, but it could also be that we're totally paranoid about the future, and we're totally paranoid to say that, oh, the world's going to be absolutely horrible. Maybe my life will be so horrible that I want to die, but I can't even kill myself. The ultimate horror. So, which is paranoia. So, or metanoia. I'm afraid that somebody's got to hit me in the head. I'm afraid that God's got to come out of the clouds and say that I'm terrible and boring and then torture me forever, or something like that. So the metanoic and the paranoid are these fantasies. Also, they're located in the fantasy of the future. But all those things are virtualization. So the virtual is located in the future. The virtual doesn't have any existence. The VPA theory, there's no existence. So we say that the virtual absists. But the thing is that we have to do exactly the same thing with the past. Nietzsche's point with amor fati is that we have to understand that we not only have to accept the past, we have to love the past. Therefore, the term amor fati. We have to love the past. It's an obligation because it is us. We are our own pasts. We are the results of our own past. If you don't love your own past, you don't love yourself. It's an obligation. In Spinoza and Nietzsche, it's an obligation to love yourself. It's not a choice you have. It's not a feeling. It's just an operation. It's just a decision. And therefore, the past subsists. There's no existence to the past. It's subsistence. But please note how the absistence and the subsistence exist within the existence. They're all three located within the existence. Therefore, existence and mythos is primary. Therefore, truth can only ever be mythical. And therefore, knowledge can never be anything but intuitive. Because when you're in the now, you don't know what's going on. You're guessing. You're guessing wildly. You never know what's going on in the now. And therefore, knowledge in itself can only ever be intuitive. So we're realizing now that of the three disciplines of philosophy, we have to locate phenomenology in the future as an subsistence. So the way we deal as philosophers, we deal with subsistence is through phenomenology. And if you study brain science, you will know that even phenomenal experience occurs before we're in any way aware of it and can react to it and experience it in ourselves. So the inner esoteric experience we have of something going on starts with an exoteric sensory experience of some kind. So it's literally in the future that touches us. So before we can process anything in the now that we create inside of ourselves, the phenomenology is there. So phenomenology is always part of the future. Therefore, pathos is part of the future. So the category of pathos has to be put together with phenomenology and be put into the future. This is what a man means when he tells the woman, I am in the future, I am in the past. Therefore, I'm terrible at being present. I expect you as a woman to be present because for you, future and past are one thing. It's like woman is transdeterminate, whereas man is indeterminate and determinate and fights between his indeterminacy and his determinacy constantly, whereas woman can therefore instead be transdeterminate. So then we have located those three along the line here as well. That means that because knowledge is connected to mythos, epistemology, which is the philosophical exercise of what does it mean to know, is located in the now. And it's located in the mythos. And this is exactly Nietzsche's point. The world is only accessible to us through epistemology, and that's why epistemology is that superior category, because epistemology is how we deal with the world, and we can then express that through a mythos, which is, for example, theater, or through a logos, which is science, or mathematics, and we can express the world through a pathos, which is like wild and crazy sex and violence, or excess of any kind. Like, so we can go into the pathic experience there. So then we put those categories there. That means that we're left with the past. We're left with the logos, which is always in the past. So the way the mind deals with the past is that it turns the past into facts, into factual reality. So it's like we have a phenomenal experience, which is actually located in the future. Then we go into the present state, the mind with the present state, and that's intuitive knowledge. And then intuitive knowledge, after intuitive knowledge, is that we try to sort out what happened. And the way we sort out what happened, by establishing facts, that's what consciousness is. Consciousness is the way that we try to make sense of the world, of past events, and give them priority and put them in hierarchy so we can decide through consciousness what's happened to what just happened to us. So of course, then we can start planning and virtualizing for the future. So hopefully we're better prepared for the future when it comes along. And this is called wisdom. And it takes a whole life. It takes a whole life and many, many, many conscious operations, to ontologize the world, to create an ontology of the world, so we know better how the world works. And here's the point. This is what wisdom is. Wisdom is located in the ontology. It's not located in the epistemology. Because a goldfish can have a certain epistemology in the present, but because the goldfish has a very small brain, it thankfully forgets about the past constantly, and therefore it literally lives in a world where everything is in you now, but it has no past within the now to relate to. Therefore, its consciousness is on a far lower level, for example, the human consciousness. And we use language, we use mathematics, we use all kinds of tools that we as human beings have, of course, to make sense of the past. We ontologize the past, and therefore ontology is placed in consciousness. What does that make the now? It makes the now subconscious. The now is always subconscious. There are tons of operations going on that I have no fucking clue about, but I do have a fucking clue about what just happened in the past. And my brain is busy with sorting out what happened in the past. And therefore we call this subconsciousness. That leaves a third category of consciousness. And that category of consciousness is, of course, the consciousness of the future, which is unconscious. We don't know. We don't know. We know that we just had a phenomenal experience. It hasn't reached our mind yet. We haven't experienced it in the now yet. And so we experience when that phenomenal experience occurs, it will then in the mind become the now, the momentum to us. It then becomes subconscious because then phenomenal experience starts interacting with everything else that's going on inside of us. And therefore, the unconscious and the indeterminate, and the conscious and the determinate collide precisely in the present. And therefore, the best way to describe the present is to describe it as subconscious. That means that the unconscious to us occurs within the subconscious. It means that the conscious occurs to us within the subconscious, and the subconscious is all we have. We have nothing but in the subconscious state to exist within. So this is how I lay out consciousness. In the ironic sense is that consciousness and ontology are really dealing with death. They're really dealing with what happened. They're ontologizing what is dead. And that's exactly why philosophers fall into that trap and believe in consciousness too much, and believe in their own consciousness too much, and find their own consciousness superior to anything else, and find ontology to be the superior philosophy. You become either Plato or Confucius. You find it very, very easy to think of yourself as superior to other human beings because you know more than they do, because you ontologize the world, and you talk about the ontology. You talk about the past as if the past was occurring and if the past had existence. It doesn't. It never did. So we can then elaborate with the now. The now is just when time collapses from the indeterminate into the determinate. Hypertime itself collapses from the indeterminate into the determinate. So in a mystical sense, that's what the present is. I haven't said a word yet about how long or short the present is. But if you then go into the esoteric, you can elaborate on that. Because we already said that mythos is the thing. We're allowed to mythologize. We're allowed to create a mythonymy, which is a deeper understanding of what mythos is. We can go into the mythonomic, which is what, for example, Andrew Luber, if he's still around here, Andrew Luber and I have been trying to do a little deeper. But if we do a mythonomy, we can study mythos more. So a mythonomy, according to this theory, when VPA theory meets narratology and becomes deep narratology, if you want to subscribe to the idea of deep narratology, it means that mythos is the ultimate truth. It's superior to logos and pathos, according to Nietzsche, because for us as humans, all to human beings, that will be the ultimate truth about us. We always feel that Shakespeare is much more truthful to us than a scientist could ever be. We always feel that great art that we run into can transform us in a way that a scientific paper never could. So if that's the case, and just wild emotions in themselves are not the truth. They're just emotional outbursts. They're seismological, they're volcanoes, volcanic eruptions, and sex and violence. They're there and plague us all the time with the different eruptions they cause us. When that's the case, with the pathos is there, well, it's much better to put that in the unconscious, isn't it? Because we're not conscious of it. Once you become conscious about the pathical narrative, you put the pathical narrative in the other category, you sort of killed it, and you formalized it, and you put it as a story about the past, and it's no longer a pathical narrative. Well, it's a pathical narrative, but it's within the subconscious. So maybe this is getting a bit trippy, I don't know, but I want us to stay with this idea of staying in the consciousness, in the subconscious here, and try to stay with the subconscious for as long as possible. And you probably know, if you've read all the 6 books that I wrote with Jan, we've never ever used the term unconscious before. To now finally go close to the term unconscious because the term, we're redefining it and finally makes sense to us, because it's a precursor to the subconscious that we've always defended. Like Nietzsche, we've always said in our books, the subconscious is superior. Consciousness is overrated. The problem with history philosophy is the overbelief in that consciousness could produce the world to us, when in reality the world has always run away from us, because the world is always in flux and always in change, and therefore consciousness can never do anything but make up its own mind about past events. And that's why consciousness is there. And you can study it by taking psychedelics or going to a brain science lab, and you will discover exactly that consciousness is only occurs after the fact. So it's like the fact has already occurred. Even your mind is deciding what you're going to think. Your mind is deciding what you're going to say and pronounce. And you then realize that, oh, you thought it, emotionally thought the entire sentence, and then suddenly your tongue just says it. By the time you're expressing something, by the time you're thinking a thought for yourself, which is speaking to yourself, by the time you engage with another human being in a conversation, your mind has already made up the entire sentence you're going to put there. So it operates in the subconscious. Consciousness is there for what happens afterwards. And therefore, we can use consciousness exactly for what it is. It comes up with this idea that we can deal with the world and we can embrace factuality. And for good reasons, we feel superior to other human beings when we can embrace factuality. We call that truth as a fact. If you're factualing things, then you certainly have a stronger logos. And if you're gonna, interact with the outside world, if you're gonna build a damn house, you better know mathematics before that. You better know exactly what you're doing. You better have a plan and design. All those things are in the logos. So therefore, consciousness is brilliant when it operates as consciousness. But when it tries to be something else but consciousness, it gets pretentious. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We do this philosophy. So that also means that the proper way to describe it, we already said that the future is virtual and it's absistence. It's absistent. We said that the now is therefore potential. It's potential. Please know how the present is potential and has existence. And therefore, the past is actual and has subsistence. And here's the problem with language. The problem with language is that people talk about the actual. And that's because they're attached to their consciousness. So you talk about, well, what actually happened was. When you say what actually happened was in the past tense, using actuality in the proper sense. But when you talk about the present, when you talk about the now as the actual, you're making a terrible mistake. Because you're eliminating your own freedom to act. This is the great insight of Hegel. The freedom to act, we're going to the esoteric again, the freedom to act, to be an agent and to be engaged with the world occurs in the present because only the present can we interact with the world because that's where the world and we have existence. So the subconscious entity that we are, the subconscious subjectivity that we are, with the intuitive understanding of the world that intuitively makes decisions and intuitively interacts with the world, emotionally interacts with the world, this state we're in is a potential. The proper way to describe now is with potency. It's like, the story about the field and the particle. I'm not saying the field and the particle is exactly what happens when the field breaks down into the particle. But I wouldn't be surprised if a physicist would actually say this rhymes perfectly with physics. Why don't we try to apply this onto physics as well? Because in physics, you have these three states. You have the field, you have the particle, but you also have the point where the field breaks down into the particle, which is how they're connected. The communicative state, when the field becomes the particle, is the third state. And that's the now. So that means the field is, in a way, for physics, a virtuality, but nothing happens in the field in itself. The field has to collide with something or engage with something. Hey, the time axis. It has to engage with something to go from a virtual field into potentiality. And the potentiality is the potentiality to be any of the possible particles that could come out of that process. So it's still field, but field goes into a state where all the different possible particles that the field could collapse into are all present. All those particles are present. And once that now's over and done with, there's only one particle left. And that's actuality, and that's the fact. So the great thing of looking at the time axis this way is you can start experimenting with applying it on other areas as well. You can start experimenting, certainly applying it and trying to understand science deeper. But the way you do it is that by looking at what is in between the field and the particle, what if that is a state where all particles are alike and potentially could be the one particle that's going to be the actual one, and then all of them done with except for one. And in this sense, we can experiment with by putting the field in the virtual category as the unconscious, interestingly enough. We could think of our unconsciousness as a huge field if you want to. And then the present is all those potentials, the potential outcomes of the field collapsing. So the indeterminate is collapsing. And all those different field, all those particle states are like alike. All those particle states are still possible. They're still possible. This is the potential state. And the potential state is then, boop, dropped into the actual state, which is the death of the field. It's the death of the field. So the field dies and collapses into a particle. And this is the way I approach time and the time axis. Of course, my work is not to speculate on science at all. We're metaphysicists here, and what we're trying to do is to try to turn this into philosophy and a deep narratology. But my suggestion is that what this does is that it creates an acceptance of the subconscious state. It creates an acceptance of intuition as fundamental. It creates a narratology that says myth is the ultimate reality. The mythic state is the ultimate reality. And there's no possibility for any Platonist or any Confucian to come along and try to say that, no, ontology is the ultimate reality. No, that's just the ultimate, that's the ultimate death. That's the ultimate way to try to come to terms with and grasp the past and include the past in the now and have an understanding of the past now, because the now is going to collapse and die into a past. And the way to approach it by going into that state and be present in that state is to accept the fact that it's incredibly intuitive. And at any given moment where I interact with the world, where I interact with you guys here right now, for example, we interact with the world, I'm in a completely subconscious state. There are tons of things going on in my body that I'm totally unconscious of. I don't know what's going on in my stomach at the moment. I don't know what my kidneys are up to. I hope they know, but I certainly don't know. My mind certainly doesn't know. My subjectivity has no knowledge of that at all. So this creates a triad, like the narratological triad, but now the triads we put along the time axis. Now, what are the constraints of this metaphysical theory? Don't follow Alex Ebert's advice here. Don't believe in anything unless there are constraints involved. The constraints involved is that time is absolute. The time axis is absolute. You cannot go beyond it. There is no world beyond time. Time is absolute. Time is God. Zoroastrianism. And I'm a Zoroastrianite, right? So time is God. That means God is born and God dies every moment. The expression of God himself is in the present, and the present is off, done with. So the ultimate birth and death process in that case is the divine. And then we can move from that state. I know I'm repeating myself slightly because I'm going back to the first session we did, but I think I need to do that here. Then we can start looking at the quality of the present moment. And this is when we go Momentalist. When we laid out the framework, when we started worshiping time as God, when we accepted the time axis as our constraint, there's no world outside of time. We can imagine worlds outside of space. We can absolutely consider space to be secondary category of time. We already know now that our phenomenal experience of time, that we construct time in our consciousnesses, is probably dead wrong. We know from science that it's getting very, very tricky when you go to physics these days. You have to go into subphysics. We realize that gravity is totally alien to everything else in physics. We understand the holographic principle is applicable on physics. We're moving into separation of physics between physics and subphysics, which I've prophesied about for like the last 20 years. But that's what we're doing. We're understanding if gravity is not a force the way the other forces of nature are, then probably gravity is a totally different category than physics, and that's really, really interesting. So once you go into subphysics and physics and start looking back on this, then we realize that if you go to the present state, we can dig deeper into that. And the real esoteric work we're doing, which I did not do in Prose and Event, which is absolutely why I'm enthusiastic about the Sufism book, is to go deeper into the presence and see what we can find. Hegel never did this. And that's what's interesting with the post-Hegelian philosophy. So, for example, if you go to Zen philosophy in Japan and you go to the great Japanese Hegelians, you go to Nishida and Nishitani, 20th century Japanese philosophy, they were brilliant, but they always came back to this idea that Somebody wrote gravity, relationship to force. We'll come back to that soon, so I can comment that later. But if you go to Zen philosophy and the critique of Hegel, like what can they do that Hegel didn't do? You know that we do narratology because narratology is what Hegel didn't do. He didn't complete his philosophy. He didn't invent the transdeterminate, the step between the indeterminate and the determinate. Hegel certainly figured out that the future collapses into the past, the indeterminate collapses into the determinate. Therefore, the past must always look determinate to us. We can't do anything about it. But the indeterminate is full of freedom, and therefore human freedom is absolute, and that's amazing. That's Hegel, right? So what the Japanese philosopher said that, well, Hegel always discusses these states as if subjectivity is constant. And that goes all the way through Nietzsche on to Heidegger. And the problem I have with Heideggerian Dasein is that the sign is discussed by Heidegger as a constant state, like it's always the same state. Now, what the Japanese said is that, well, there is subjectivity, but there is in meditation a state where you meditate all the way down to something with Nishida called pure experience. Can you please notice here that it's like you meditate yourself toward a state, like if you're getting close and close into the phenomenal experience itself. Can you see how it's like you're now move slightly head into the future as if you can experience the future before you register the now. And that's what happens in meditation when you go towards a state which is called pure experience. So we need to understand that subjectivity can move into pure experience, and their subjectivity is lost. The nature of pure experience is that subjectivity is gone. It's no longer there. All right, so if I do manage to squeeze my subjectivity closer towards the virtual, closer towards the phenomenal, be directly phenomenal if you like to, then my subjectivity drops. Dasein is gone. All right, Japanese dealt a lot with that, and they figured out the pure experience is lacking in Hegelian philosophy. And the way to do that is that you go into a state of pure indeterminacy. And when you meditate all your way into pure indeterminacy, the transdeterminate quality of the present is gone. The past is no longer there. It's like you have direct access to phenomenal experience. That means the Japanese are onto something, and that means it strengthens our theory of deep narratology. Oh, subjectivity has a spectrum. All right. And, you know, Andrew and I have been going on about this quite a lot lately, and I get excited about Zufism, and he gets very excited about Vajrayana. And the way the Sufis and the Vajrayanas address the Zen is that they are a bit stale and boring, aren't they? There's no life to it. So what are they going to do with sex and violence and all the gutsy things in life they truly want to enjoy, and they're popping up anyway in the back of their brains? And that's why the Japanese are so damn perverted. And nobody's more perverted than a Zen monk, because when they're not sitting in that pure experience state, which they can't all day long because they got to go to work and they got to get things done, and the fucking rock garden has to be fixed, and, you know, the whole temple has to look beautiful, and you need to get some fucking sleep. You need to eat. All those things you need to do where you can't sit in that meditative state and behind yourself and then suddenly lose yourself in that pure experience. That's just one extreme. And here's the funny thing. The concept that John and I worked on and presented in the Symphysm book was the exact opposite of the pure experience, which is the infinite now. Please note that the infinite now is infinite. It's not eternal, because nothing is eternal. It's infinite in the sense that the closer you get to zero dialectically, the closer you also get to infinity. And we all know that zero and infinity are mathematical concepts. There's no reality to them in physical reality in any way whatsoever. They were made up for strictly convenient reasons. It was actually traders in Venice who imported the zero and the infinity sign from the East, because the Mongol invasions had shocked the world, and everybody discovered the Mongols organized everything according to decimals. So the Mongols had 1 soldier, 10 soldiers, 100 soldiers, 1,000 soldiers. Everything was according to decimals. And then suddenly the Jewish traders in Venice discovered, my God, it's really nice to have a zero to play around with, and go from 9 to 10, and go from 99 to 100, and go from 999 to 1,000 by adding the zero, which is a virtual, right? It's a virtual. It's not there. There's nothing there. So if you look at the zero sign, it's simply a sign with nothing behind it. But the zero sign is therefore closely related to the infinity sign. And you know mathematics, if you divide anything with zero, you get the infinity sign. It's the only thing you can possibly get. So the only way to deal with the zero was to also introduce the infinity sign. You can't do mathematics with only one of them. You have to have them both because they're a perfect example of a dialectical deadlock. You have to have them both to have any of them. Now, if you have both the zero and you have the infinity sign, and you start thinking about them, and you start thinking about meditating, and you're going towards a state which is very similar to a zero state, like there's absolutely nothing there, that the self dissipates, disappears. It's like you're moving into pure phenomenology, which is what Nishida calls pure experience. It's pure phenomenology. If you go into that state of pure phenomenology, you created one side of the spectrum, then you suddenly discover that the other end of the spectrum must be infinity. So what would that mean? What is it like to be a subject in infinity? Well, of course, when you go into an infinity state, into absolute excess, absolute bliss, when you go into absolute bliss, your subjectivity disappears. It's no longer there. Subjectivity itself is dialectical. Subjectivity exists in that realm right between the infinite now and the pure experience, and in between those two extreme states where subjectivity is dissolved. So the way you speak about it, that really what you're doing is that you're organizing your own neurosis by going into the pure experience. It's an absolute zero state in that sense. And you're basically organizing and putting yourself into complete ultimate psychosis, which is a very blissful state. An organized psychosis is an incredibly blissful state. If you've been high on psychedelics, or if you meditate all the way through, sleep deprivation or whatever you want to, if you go into that state, it's a completely overwhelming psychotic experience. It's an absolute oceanic feeling. You and the universe become one. That's where subjectivity is dissolved in the other end. In one end, the subjectivity is meaningless. In the other end, the subjectivity and the world becomes one, and the one and you become one thing. So that's, of course, there's a point to that people talk about unification with God, which what Sufis call it when they go into that absolute state of absolute bliss, and we just call it the infinite now. The now is short, like it's over and done with. It's no longer future. It's not past yet. But at the same time, this now that we have in the beginning, it can also, in the other end, on the vertical end, be considered absolute infinite. It's a poetic description, of course, but then we use language here mythically. We're allowed to do a philosophy that leaves the logos. We're doing a philosophy that goes into the mythos, and that's the whole point with the Sufism project. Because for me, with Procediment, I was finished doing philosophies and logos, and I want to try to see if I can do philosophies and mythos, and that's what we're doing here. So of course, we're going into descriptions of states. We can only have poetic descriptions of these states. And the best way to poetically describe something, like pure experience, the infinite now, is to use a contradiction. And both pure experience and the infinite now are contradictions. So, yeah, it's the deep narratology we're talking about here. So the way momentalism then relates historically to philosophy is momentalism has always escaped into the esoteric, because if it is the ultimate way of addressing human subjectivity and human experience, then it doesn't serve the powers of the world. So if you go back to the Bronze Age, and as I always do, these very, very serious questions, a very serious question about what do we do with larger than tribe? If we now historically go into population sizes that are larger than tribe. And of course, we made up the history that permanent settlement was the beginning of civilization. I think there's one thing we're going to kill very soon, is the idea that the birth of civilization was permanent settlement. I love this idea that the Chinese wall was built just as much to keep Chinese taxpayers in as it was to keep Mongol invaders out. We're increasingly going to see civilization, like Freud did, as much as a prison as a liberty. But civilization occurred. Larger populations were created. new theories came through philosophy, and we go into the axial age, and here's the problem. So we go into the axial age, Confucius in the East and Plato in the West come along, and they create incredibly popular theories based on consciousness as first category, based on ontology as first philosophy, based on perfect eternal forms, based on straight lines, armies walking in straight lines, creating empires rigidly, firmly, dictatorially held together. Plato's Republic and Confucius' works. And this is what cursed the East and cursed the West, was that Confucius and Plato came during the axial age, and their idea of containing populations larger than the sociant was that when there's no loyalty between people, because loyalty stops at the size of the sociant. We're firmly, evidently proven anthropologically that human beings do not have loyalty between 1,200 people at a time. We can't even remember more than 1,200 people at a time. Nobody has 5,000 Facebook friends. That's just American hyperbole. People have 5,000 Facebook acquaintances, which is something entirely different. I might remember who you are if you try to remind me, because you're no longer in my consciousness. I'm not no longer conscious of you. We could literally say the consciousness cannot harbor more than 1,200 people, which proves that the sociant biologically is the ultimate size. So the interesting thing is that the exoteric, because permanent settlements exploded, populations grew, the exoteric was won over by Confucianism and Platonism. And now we understand why these theories were so popular. Because they created a larger membrane than the sociant and fantasized about have a larger member, like nation all the way up to empire. And if you have an empire, then you must protect the empire by organizing an army, and you must tell the army a myth that dying for the emperor is the most noble thing you could ever do. Not dying for the sociant. Not dying for your own family, not dying for your clan, not dying for your tribe. No. Dying for the emperor himself is the most noble thing you can do. And as a woman, giving birth to a child who's the emperor's property is the most noble thing you can do. This is the exoteric. This is exoteric ideology. And it's based on language and the limitation of language. And therefore, an empire can only be held together by having a military to protect it from the outside, which is the defense of the membrane, the membranic of the exterior membrane. And then the interior membrane is the police. And that's the structure of a population which is organized larger than the sociant. So we're starting to fight against ourselves. We start to domesticate not just plants and animals. We start to domesticate ourselves as human beings. We allow our leaders to domesticate us and tame us to fit within systems larger than tribe, and this is the law. Therefore, the law is a linguistic phenomenon. It's first orally, and finally written. And by being written, the law can therefore be duplicated, and the law can be implemented, and the law is implemented through an elite who speak the same language. Therefore, there must be language that ties the empire together. The Roman Catholic Church is tied together by Latin. America is tied together by English, right? The British Empire had English first. The French Empire had French. The Persian Empire had Persian. And sometimes you pick another, the Ottoman Empire was also held together by Persian, doesn't matter. India switched from Persian as the imperial language because South Indians refused to speak Hindu. So they had Persian as their imperial language in India until they switched to English in the 19th century. But you got to have this one language which the elite speaks. It's even an advantage for imperial construction that the elite speaks a language that the rest of the people cannot speak. That's called slavery. So slavery is invented. There is no slavery in tribes. None. Slavery is invented by civilization. And we're all slaves to a system. And this is the exoteric. And therefore, the exoteric system is built on Plato and Confucius because they're popular with the leaders, because the only way to keep a large system together is by implementing exotericism according to Plato and Confucius. You can now see that pop religions like Islam and Christianity came along, were invented, were added to these systems because they fitted perfectly into these ideas. Both in Islam and Christianity have their origin in Plato. And there were Platonist influences, where Islam came out of Zoroastrianism and Christianity came out of Judaism. I prefer to go back to Judaism and Zoroastrianism. They're far less big-headed than Islam and Christianity are. They don't convert everybody they ever meet with a gun, and they don't try to create, religious empires at all. And therefore, they're much more credible today. I wrote about it in the process event. This is why I love the Persian Hebrew Axis. But what you should challenge me to do tonight when we go into this interactive stage is basically, what if the Persian Hebrew Axis is just the first step towards understanding the esoteric? And here's the trick. The esoteric is concerned with the present. The esoteric is fundamentally momentalist. The esoteric is this deep, deep, urgent search towards the ultimate truth. And since the ultimate truth is mythical, and it's humbling to understand the ultimate truth is mythical. Science is not the ultimate truth. Neither is speculation about the future. Wild ideologies, fantasies about heavens or hells that are coming in the future are not truth. The truth is contingent. The truth is open. We are interacting with the future. I mean, the future is contingent. The future is open. And we still have possibilities to plan for the future, engage with the future, although we're doing a subconscious state, and then we act in the subconscious state, which is when we are potential agents, potential subjects that are acting in the world, dialectical subjects, potentiality, acting in the world, and we're doing it. And this is what the esoteric search is for. And therefore, the esoteric has to accept that the limitation of language is that the language of the logos drops. And the language of the pathos is not good enough because it's just basically fucking somebody or killing somebody with a weapon or acting hum. No, we have to go to the present state where we neither have the pathos nor the logos. The only thing we have is the mythos. The only thing we have is art as a religion, theater as a religion. We only have the theater and the art and the true artistic art, the only thing that's there. And we go into esoteric and suddenly language drops. And language has no power over us. And the possibility to find humanity in complete and utter strangers occurs to us, because when none of us has a language to use as a weapon, language drops out of the picture, and all that exists is the potential present, which is subjectivity, and subjectivity can then go to pure experiences of the infinite now, and we can share those experiences. We can meditate with the others towards pure experience. We can go into blissful states, absolute ecstatic states with others through all kinds of things and experiences. And we can share those infinite experiences to now, which is the bliss that we then memorize and remember and live with. A child being born, the highest state we've ever been on LSD, whatever you want to do it, or the best fucking sex you ever had. Any one of those totally blissful states you've been in, you have to come out of them. You have to come out back to reality, to a dialectical subjectivity where everyday life occurs. But by remembering you've been in that state and having that memory with you and remembering the bliss is still with you. Okay, so I want to sort of leave it at that. I'm not into a full hour, but I would love to bring in you guys if you want to have conversations on this, but this was my plan to end the second session at this date. So we'll see where we can take us. So esoteric is basically beyond language, and that's the point. Therefore, esoteric unites shamans and shamanoid personalities across cultures, and therefore shamanoid personalities are the only ones that can go between tribes, go between cultures, between nations, between empires. They don't see the stranger as a stranger. They see every stranger as a brother and sister in the shamanic caste, and therefore they go peacefully between communities and communicate with complete strangers by simply understanding the limitation of language itself. But we're the rebels against civilization, in the sense that we're the rebels against the slavery that civilization must create. Okay?
Awesome, Alexander. Thank you. If people want to put up their hands for questions, I can start off with a question, if you don't mind. Oh, I was thinking as you were talking between the trade war between China and America, and I'm wondering if that's a war between Confucian society and Plato, or between big empires of exoteric, sutric, rule-based, print-based society, and that what's happening right now is much more, let's say, on closer to McLuhan's electric age or internet age, where that's not really working. It's just monolithic things going against each other. Anyway, just a thought. I wonder maybe.
Yeah. Okay. I would say I would find the answer to that question by going to Taiwan and talk to Taiwanese Chinese intellectuals and feel the closeness we have with them and their understanding of American and European culture and the affinity they have with us, and also their incredible, the incredible self-confidence in being Taiwanese and being the other Chinese. And what happened in Taiwan was, of course, that Confucianism became far less important and Taoism exploded. So I would say what you're talking about here is within Chinese culture. The difference between Taoism, I'm a Taoist, I'm a Zoroastrian, hates Persian Taoism. Taoism is Chinese Zoroastrianism. Whenever I sit down and discuss the yang and the yin and discuss the yang, yong, yin, we do in the process of man, I find the same pattern with Asha and the Drush, and I see the same, Asha, Tao, same thing. It's like whatever kinds of truth there are out there, those truths are the most important. The truth comes in the pluralism, the multiple, and therefore narratology is incredibly Zoroastrian. So what I try to do with that work is basically sit down with the Taoists and look at the China that way. Where America is located is America is also located in this confused state because Western culture is also there for the conflict between Platonism and the sort of liberty, almost the anarchistic tradition, I would say libertarian traditions, etc., that you have in America right now. And therefore, America right now is incredibly schizoid. I would say that a given prophecy right now is Elon Musk is about to leave. He's supposed to drop out because whatever you think of Elon Musk, but he's a libertarian. And where things are going with Donald Trump is becoming a Peronist. Trade war is definitely Peronist. It's not libertarian at all. But I think it's more pragmatic than that. I think the way to look at the possible solution of it is that it's pragmatic. And I would say that the serious thing about the trade war is that there are incredibly strong imbalances in power relations in the world. And the Chinese have been really, really good at sneaking in everything, everywhere. And I think with the Americans sit at the Pentagon and discover that the Ukrainians have created these awesome drones for very little money out of Chinese components. And this is killing the entire American defense model because the American defense model is built on the super, super expensive fighter planes and super, super expensive, tanks and everything. And suddenly these drones are going to kill the planes and kill the tanks. And the Pentagon has discovered that, oh my God, Elon Musk is going to come in here any day and take over the whole thing and create defense tech or something. I think when they see that since all the components in the Ukrainian drone are Chinese, and we're totally dependent on China, because China's made sure that we're totally dependent on China for just about everything. There's always a detail in everything you produce in America where there's a Chinese component that China alone produces in the world. This is the shock. Now, how you deal with that? There are different ways of dealing with that. Because Donald Trump has promised not to lower the taxes. Although America is running the biggest fucking budget deficit in history, then his solution to the problem, as an ultra-rich New Yorker who gets away with everything with the working class in America and fucks them in the ass, is to say that we're not going to lower the taxes because I lowered the taxes the last time, and that's exactly why I have a huge budget deficit. And then Biden came in through the door and spent money he never had, and spent money like America was at war with the entire world and the universe or whatever. And now America has the biggest fucking budget deficit in human history, and that's deeply problematic because it makes us dependent on the Chinese buying our fucking bonds. Now, if that is the situation, it's a very, very insecure situation for America. Now, the way he deals with that is not to tell the Americans we need to raise the taxes and we need to spend less, which is a civilized way to do it. No, he's going to keep the taxes lower, maybe even lower them. And the way he's then figured out in his own little fantasy with Paul Navarro is that we're just going to raise tariffs because tariffs are taxes. And therefore, the tariffs in America is the biggest tax increase in American history. But the trick is that the foreigners get to pay all the taxes, not the Americans. Because if you want to deal with us Americans so fucking fancy, you have to pay our bills by us raising tariffs enormously. That's Trump's model. There's method to the madness. Is he going to get away with it? Not without everybody going poorer. But maybe he'll win. Maybe his model will win. Maybe Americans are happy being poorer as long as they don't have to pay the fucking taxes. So that's It's pragmatic. It's like the way to address Trump's problem right now is to say that, well, Wall Street is gonna stay lower and lower and lower. And apparently, right before we started this conversation, he once again said that I'm going to keep the tariffs away for 90 days or something, and the stock exchange went up, right? Madly. This is what happens all the time because the stock exchange is just a place where people sit and calculate if they're going to get any profits out of their fucking stocks, or if they're going to get the bonds paid back by U.S. Treasury. And if they don't believe that any longer, then the prices of the stock and the price of the bonds fall. So America is now stuck with the idea that this will hurt everybody, but it will hurt America more than anybody else. But maybe America will stop being dependent on China. If America wants to be less dependent on China, and at least being equal with China in world affairs, because they didn't get Putin to change sides. Putin stayed with Xi. It's much more stable. He just told Trump basically to fuck off, and probably the mullahs will too. So if that fails for Trump, then Trump's strategy is not working. And it's an incredibly costly strategy because ultimately America pays the price. So Trump is not smart enough to be Confucian. He's certainly not fluid enough to be Taoist. He's just being highly, highly speculative, and I would say intensely not spiritual.
So on the spiritual level, Alexander, just to follow up. So what about the whole technological aspect of the electric age? You know, that isn't that about nowness? Isn't that about the now? Whereas text, you know, this is McLuhan's analysis, is text removes us and you know, from the now on some level.
Well, it is in a certain sense because time is God. So future, now, and present haven't really changed at all. But space has changed dramatically. And because space has changed dramatically, Marshall McLuhan is right. It started with the telegraph. It was shocking that you could sit with the telegraph in the 19th century London, and if something happened in New York, you would know the next minute. You see how almost instant this becomes to human beings?
Yeah,
And the
light speed.
space between New York and London has disappeared. And because space disappears to us, it seems to us the entire world is coming towards a now. And of course, this now increasingly look as a really weird, mad, infinite now, a psychotic state where space has dissipated completely. And you could even move your body to the other side of the planet in 24 hours. You could afford the flight ticket to do it. You could even do that, right? Soon you're going to get up in a rocket and get there in 6 minutes or something. But literally, we're taking technology to the point where the entire planet becomes a now. And therefore, the sort of space-time understanding that time is different depending on where you are in space dissolves completely. It no longer has an effect of us because as long as we're on this planet, we're all in the constant now. And it's only when we look out into space and see galaxies far, far away that are billions of light years away, we finally remember that we live in a world where the light that hits us is in the now, but what it communicates to us, the galaxy left before behind, was billions of years ago in the past. So that galaxy is an ontological phenomenon, whereas my light experience is a phenomenological phenomenon. So I would say we live in increase now. So we talk a lot about how much nowness we have in now. It's not really time that has changed. It's space that has shrunk so intensely towards a now. And stupid people today live in the sensations of the now all the way. And they live so preoccupied in the subjectivity and the nowness of things that they live from one sensation to the next. And the answer to that in our philosophy is attentionism, is to be mature enough to get away from the sensations, step away. That's why we build monasteries. That's why we go to retreat centers, that we start to meditate. We go so we can go away from the sensations that constantly attack us through the media all the time. Because of what happened, we live in the age of absolute sensationalist media, because media fights with other media for our attention. And the way to fight for attention for most people is to fight through sensations. Donald Trump is the perfect example of that. He's a totally sensationalist president. His problem is that he doesn't understand dynamics. Obviously not. He doesn't understand economics because they're very much dynamic. He understands dramatics. He's a totally dramatic president with no understanding of dynamic. And the problem is when he deals with things like economics is that economics is deeply dynamical. And he doesn't understand dynamics. That's why he's like an 11-year-old when he does the numbers at the White House. So I would say the nowness that feels increased is not that now has changed at all. I think these categories, future, present, and past, are the same always. I think what has changed is that our conceptual space has changed dramatically. And therefore, we have an intense sense of nowness that starts more and more to feel like this esoteric state of the infinite now.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should we
Ronald.
bring in Ronald?
Thank you. Do you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Okay, great. So I have three remarks about what you said. It's more like remark, question, expansion to kind of complete, and give you more things to think about. The first is about some remark about quality of consciousness, because you talk about, how the subjectivity is different, like in its quality of presence. The second remark will be about the esoteric of what I call the architectonic of resonance. That is why the esoteric beyond language, what does it mean really? And the other is about a term found in micro-sociology called situation and interaction. So how it connects with the present, because I really like this idea of the subconscious and the present. So I will
Right,
explain
but let's
very
just
briefly.
take them all three. They're brilliant. So let's start with the
Yes.
first one. Please repeat it first so we all remember it.
Okay.
Huh?
So the first is the quality of consciousness as a ritual chain. So I will explain what this means. So basically, I have this book here called the global theory of intellectual change, the sociology of philosophy. It's from Randall Collins. It's a sociology book where he study all of the philosopher mystics of history through the lens of micro-sociology and
I'm
explain
bringing
them.
out the notebook, okay?
Yes. And
What do you call
basically,
the book? The book is called?
it's called Sociology of Philosophy, the Sociology of
Brilliant
Philosophy.
title. Yeah.
Yes, by Randall Collins.
Sociology, all philosophy. It sounds like it's sociologist killing his father here or something like that.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, it's in this lineage of Durkheim and stuff like that. And so Durkheim in sociology has his explanation about what is ritual. So basically, what in the sacred is the sacred. And he explained that this is the ritual that you go through. A ritual is when people together go in a group toward a sacred object and synchronize the body through language, being, waves. So this is the acoustics. So basically, when you talk about all of those things about esoteric as this thing outside of language, that is the resonance experience of the religious experience. It's what happened prior to language. And this is a concept you also find in Peter Sloterdijk with psychoacoustics. He used that in the Sphere book when, for example, he said when you are the baby in the womb, the first senses that develop in the brain and the nervous system is the acoustic sense. You have to shut down all the sound when you are in the womb, and so you can focus. This is what creates the first definition of focus, and it also relates to a sense of premonition, that is the future. From that sense of acoustic, you can feel the future. And so basically, when I talk about the quality of consciousness as ritual chain, what I mean by that is that depending on how effective the sacred ritual that you are involved your consciousness with, it changed the quality of that, not as you said, it's not like there's a design or the same subjectivity every time, but there is a flux. And that qualitative flux toward the above depends on the quality of the ritual. That is the body going together into a certain type of ritual that gives them emotional energy. This is what allows them to continue to believe in the future, to talk, to be. So
Can I
religion.
just interfere? Because
Yes.
you're gonna write your own book on this stuff, Ronald. This is so fucking brilliant. I love having you here. But can we just play with it then and say that the infinite now, for example, could be above subjectivity, like above, and we can then put pure experience like below subjectivity. So subjectivity could be that in between state between these two. Would that be something that rhymes with you, or would you like
that could be something, yeah, like the infinite. That what I really like, because this infinite would be like this nothingness you talk about with Nishida. When you reach like the point where subjectivity dissolve. Can you talk? Is this dissolution nothingness?
No, the infinite now is rather like the psychotic state of the entire universe super existing and you are it.
Okay.
So it's like total wholeness. It's obviously what a child experiences with the mother when it sucks the tit. I mean, you experience this complete total unity. And this is Freudian, like what we're missing, because we never can return to that unity except if we go into the infinite now. Freud was critical of it because it was a bit of a logos guy. He was critical of it. He called it the oceanic feeling that religions are dealing with. I'm a bit skeptical, that whole thing, because Freud never got there. But I think we should actually embrace it. I mean, Andrew and I are defending it. We think it's lacking in Zen. What's lacking in Zen Buddhism is precisely what Vajrayana and Sufism have. They don't have a problem at all in going into this absolute ecstatic bliss. And I would say it's not nothingness. No, it's rather absolute. It's just everything. It's like everything. If that's the everything state in a way, the nothing state is pure experience, where you meditate yourself towards a state where just absolutely nothing drops off, and finally your subjectivity drops off too. There's not even a self there. So you experience your no self, for example. And that's incredibly Zen. If that's lacking among the Sufis, then we need to take that, the Zen part here from the Zen, and then start to re-exploring pure experience and put that into it. I would say in the esoteric, these are two extreme states. And then subjectivity is like a spectrum in between, where you can go more towards the psychotic or more towards the neurotic, and that's subjectivity. You can also become dysfunctional and fall on the side. That's where you have a dysfunctional subjectivity and you get into psychiatric states, you know. But as long as you're running in between these two states and starting to play with them, I think a lot of the esoteric practice would be, when we're through with this, esoteric practice would be that we can go into both extreme states, occasionally go into the infinite now and go to the peak experience, memorize them, remember what they're like, so I can live within my everyday dialectical subjectivity, have my cup of coffee and go to work like I do every day, and enjoy it too, because then I enjoy my subjectivity fully. And the more I am in between the two, the stronger I would probably experience my subjectivity as well. So that's the theory. But go back to your theory. Go back to your theory.
Yes. Yeah. So, and memory is a big thing too, because it's related to the ritual. Great, powerful, energetic ritual leaves a strong imprint as a memory within the gene, within the active psychoacoustic body.
Brilliant.
Which then becomes
exactly. So when you do spiritual experiences, you always talk about the intention and the ceremony and the integration. Another trait perfectly rhymes with this. The intention is to plan for the event. It's future to the event. It's like virtualizing the event. The intention is not what's going to happen. The intention is an intention of what could possibly happen, have a spectrum. It could go wrong. It could go right. It could be something I never expected. It could be incredibly predictable. And all those things are okay. And that's when I'm finished with the intention. So I'm virtualizing the ceremony. Then I go into the ritual, into the ceremony, and experience the ceremony. I'm there. And I remind myself when I'm in there that it's too late to have an intention. Intention must not change. And it's too early to integrate. It's like people go into deep, say they're in the middle of an ayahuasca experience, and I realize they're trying to integrate in the middle of it. I just go up to them and say, stop integrating. Remember you told me when we made the intention, you're not going to integrate yet. We'll integrate tomorrow. Stay with the experience. And then you stay with the experience. You're in the present intensely throughout the whole ceremony, and then you more or less collapse. Then you go to sleep, maybe eat something the next day, you sit a bit exhausted, but you're coming back to your sobriety again, and then you can start integrating, and that's conscious. That's what consciousness does. So the consciousness is brilliant. But consciousness is always how we integrate what just happened. And that's why we call it actuality. So that's where I put it.
And to finish with the situation thing. So basically what I really like about subconsciousness as the present is that right now, like subjectivity is always happening within a situation. That is a time space where, for example, right now, this is a situation. I'm in this Zoom call talking with you. There is a motivation to be there, but it's all of that is subconscious. It's like I have a past and things that makes me go there. It's not like I choose to be there and do all of that, and think about all of those things. And every situation is always in interaction with a potential future and the past that drives it. That's why the present is subconscious, because right now I am in a chain of interaction as a situation of the symbols around me, where I'm like, I choose this symbol motivates me. This symbol demotivates me, and that gives me a certain synopsis or direction of that, situation, from situation to situation. That's why I call it a chain of situation, interactional chain of situation as the present. So that situation as the subconscious, I found it very interesting. And so last point with that, I would like to know, what do you think is exactly the agentic part within that presence? If right now I am in a subconscious state and I am like this continuum of this past and me thinking about
and all your decisions are intuitive.
Yes.
Everything you decide, I decide what I think, I decide what I feel.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the pointer is that history has taught us that you cannot judge me for that state. You can only judge me in hindsight afterwards. That's exactly why the law and Plato and Confucius and the religions that go with them, they always go towards consciousness and want to claim that consciousness occurs in the present, because if you're conscious about something, they can judge you for what you're conscious of. So it's always a conscious, supposedly conscious subject being judged. And that's why the law is impossible. It's a lie ultimately, because that shift from the subconscious to the conscious is basically how I deal with what I did. There's no intention, there isn't any longer. I try to integrate what has happened to me and the world and try to integrate it into a new subjectivity and new understanding of the world. And through the integrated process, suddenly the police stormed through the door and they accused me of something. And I'm no longer the person I was, but they accused me of still being that person, but in a conscious state, and therefore they can put me in the present.
Yeah. So how do you differentiate between the hypnosis of being subconsciously in the present and the agentic part of that presence? Where is the agentic part?
The agentic part is that the action can only happen in the present. And the present state is subconscious. So I make my decisions intuitively, and in the best of cases, there's an element of consciousness in it. I acknowledge that there's an element of consciousness in it, and therefore I'm honest to myself when I act. And that's what an action is.
Is it related to the quality?
As soon as the action has been acted, it's dead and over, it's part of the past, and therefore it has to be resorted to amor fati and we completely accept it.
Okay.
But the way to look at this, I've always said that now does not have a time limit. Isn't that interesting? That means we could look at a human life as a now. And we could look at whatever existed before you were born as virtual. And we could everything that's going to happen after you're dead as actual. You're a living, constant potential. You're perfectly allowed, if you go esoteric, which we're allowed to here, there's a point with the book, if you go esoteric, then we're allowed to see our own lives as a constant potentiality. And that's a very humane way of looking at human life. But the closer you get to the now as it is, you know, what as existence, the closer you get to your own existence, or the existence and the subconscious intuitive state as existence is, you know, that kind of subjectivity that exists there, the closer you get to that, the more nothingness and the more infinite it will look. The more we get to that infinity zero axis, and suddenly we look more and more like, okay, the only way to really get to the now is either go completely unity with everything, which is the Sufi way, or go completely into nothingness state, which is the Zen way.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
And you had more questions or something. I'm going to talk to Luber.
It's good for now. Yes, I will pass for the yes.
Are you sure?
Thank
You can come back later too. We have an
hour. For now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Luber, you're next.
Okay, so I got a couple questions, but I guess I'll just say two of them. Okay, I guess my one question here is about time modality. It seems like what is the case is that there's different how you operate under certain language games provides different experiences with time. So if you have like a certain language game where you're not explicitly in tune with it, like consciously, you're in pure action, as you're kind of saying, and time can kind of feel more in the background and not as much as the foreground because you're so much in the content itself. With that being said, I guess what narratology rubs up against is the byproduct of what it rubs up against with metaphysics, basically trying to throw the subject into these like timeless states. Like that's I guess one question, which is what is the result of having this deep narratology for the subject itself as it relates to time? And then the other part to that question is
we can start with that question. Let's stay with that question.
Okay.
I'm a bit overwhelmed as well by you guys because you're also very challenging and very advanced and all that. So let's just take it one question at a time. So the humble understanding of subjective experience is that the way it constructs its understanding of the world, of a self within a world, where the self is the exception to the world. Very Hegelian, also very Heideggerian. It's like the self is, the subject is the one thing lacking in the substance, and therefore it's filled. We fantasize about it, we fill it with some kind of a content, right? So the constraint of the subject is that the subject itself must start as a negation. I called it the dialectics of negation and oscillation as the first dialectics. So at least for the subjective experience itself, dialectics must start with negation being different than oscillation. So everything, if everything is flux and there's no difference, the first thing that is different from that flux is negation. It's a lack of flux. And of course, in Plato, this becomes the dream of the eternal form. The dream of the eternal form starts with negation itself. Hegel just says that, no, negation is an absolute start. So difference between negation and oscillation is first difference. So it's non-oscillation is start. And then we fill that with content. So we start filling ourselves with content. And because we run into experiences constantly, and we start to memorize these experiences, and then of course our memories become memories of memories of memories, because we don't correctly remember anything, because we emotionally just remember everything. We just stock up all these, but we have this idea that I've lived for 64 years and I wasn't the same person 30 years, obviously, but maybe I was the same person 3 days ago, because the closer I get to the now, the more I look like what I am now. But the further back into my past I look, the more different I am from what I am now, because we change all the time too. Everything is in flux. And what happens is that because we start to look at the world that way, the self fills itself up with the content. And in Hegel and Lacan, at least, I think Heidegger agrees, it's basically that we're so obsessed with filling this negation with the negation of the negation, which is the self. We're filling it with some kind of content so it looks like it's a thing. We objectify ourselves, and that's what we call subject. Now, this subject that relates to the world as substance. So everything else is substance, and the exception to the substance is the subject. Now, the thing, though, is that then once you start seeing this, you see the bigger picture, is that how do you humbly, but honestly, and maybe mystically, try to approach this and say, but what the hell then is the subject if it changes all the time too? Can at least allow it to be the same for at least a while? And then we humbly say, yes, you may. You may that if you honestly recognize that your subject is a temporary myth. So you can go into the mythos and you can allow yourself to temporarily be true and be truth. And that's agency. And because you allow yourself to temporarily be agency, that subjectivity that can enact with the world and be responsible for its actions and love being engaged with the world and be a free agent in the world. And therefore we say that truth, if it's ultimately mythical, it's also ultimately temporary. And the humility required of anybody who's honest is to say that I live in a world of temporary myths because my own sense of self, my own self, is a temporary myth. And then we say, fine, allow it to be a temporary myth for as long as you like. If you want it to be a year or a week or a day or a minute or whatever, then I would just recommend that the stronger states you go into, the more you go towards the pure experience, or the more you go towards the infinite now, I would recommend you to maybe allow that temporary myth to be shorter because you're in a very, 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 very extreme state. And then maybe it's just better, as I do spiritual work, to always remind yourself that to be sober on a Monday morning, have a cup of coffee, go to work, is something you should return to all the time, because that's where your subjectivity is strongest. So that's how I look at subjectivity, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. So I think I agree with that outlook on subjectivity. It just gets complicated when, like, for example, like, in a certain sense, to realize the number one, you kind of have to count to two first. It's like, oh, well, if you count to two first, you see that you deduce one out of two, and that's the ironic thing about understanding one. So like there's a certain like time modality that becomes present when you become aware of a certain, for just getting the sentiment across, for this a certain time modality emerges when a certain awareness of, like, I'm thinking of like Aristotle's nous, like a certain awareness occurs. So when you're in this state, for example, when you're like, oh, I'm playing a sport and I'm so in the sport, and you're not even thinking about time because you're just so in it. Ironically, that's a certain awareness that actually affords you to not be aware of the time. So
I call it dialectical subject for a reason. I think you
Right.
just talk about dialectics here. That's what dialectics is.
No, that it is. It's just,
and everything is, you know, in my world, everything is fundamentally dialectical. The only way we as human beings, being humans and having conversations and constructing philosophy is a human exercise. The only way we can look at the world is to look at the world like, okay, if anything is fundamentally something, it's dialectical fundamentally. Because I think difference exists before wholeness. I think difference is, there's no pointing, it's like people talk about subphysics and say subphysics is interesting. Actually, it's only interesting because it's not physics. And because it's prior to physics, and it irritates physicists enormously. Because subphysics in itself is so much dealing with virtuality that it's not really that interesting. So I think that applies here too. But because the world doesn't get interesting until difference occurs, we cannot understand the world without difference. They cannot be subject to the substance without difference. So for me, I agree with Badiou. I oppose Plato in the sense that at least be opposite to Plato, like Badiou is. He's like a reverse Platonist. But I say difference is first category at all times. So for me, I call that pan-dialecticism. I don't know if it makes sense to you, but I think what you describe, maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me or somebody else can correct me, but I think you call it time modality. I just think it's dialectics. And dialectics, of course, runs along the time axis. The absolute dialectics is the dialectics of time itself.
I completely agree. The reason why I'm saying, like,
it's like you could almost challenge ourselves to say, what if time is a subject? Therefore, I call it.
No, I want to take that seriously.
And write about it, and do Luberian philosophy about it. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. I love that whole challenge. Why don't we just look at time as a subject in that case and see who do we become then? Oh yeah, we're objects to the subject, and therefore we must submit to it. Yeah, that's what Servanites do. It's just like, I worship time. What God do you worship? My God exists very much. It exists actually every moment. That's what time is. So,
So basically, if we take time seriously like that, is there a limit to how many different modes of time can emerge? Is there an infinite amount, or that's like basically my one question? And then the other part is just my narratology producing.
Yeah, okay. My point is this: that I'm suggesting a spectrum from the infinite now to pure experience as the ultimate extreme states. And you can have as many modalities of subjectivity you like along the spectrum because it continues. It might even have that shape or something like that, like it goes around rather than just a line. But let's call it vertical because vertical is helpful. And therefore, I suggested before that we could talk about it above and below. So the above experience is the infinite now. It's the Sufi experience of total bliss and unity with God. And therefore the other experience at the bottom is like total no self-emptiness. There's nothing there at all. And I find those states really interesting. But what's interesting about them again is because they're extremes. And that allows us to build a spectrum in between. And you can, maybe we should hijack Dasein and do Dasein plus and say Dasein as a spectrum if you want to. I'm perfectly happy with that. I just call it dialectical subjectivity. And subjectivity is fundamentally dialectical because the experience, because the insight that the most extreme states have no self. All right, then we can start speculating on that the self is actually in between the most extreme states. That means that the closer you are to the middle of that spectrum, the stronger you would experience your subjectivity. And we'll see if that goes all the way through. I haven't started writing a book yet. You haven't started writing your book yet. So let's see if we can go all the way through. But there's something about this verticality between these two most extreme states. And they're all happening in the present now. They're all existence.
Right.
There's an existence.
I'll just say what you're making me think with narratology is that the byproduct can be crafting basically different. Like I'm going to craft a certain time modality that if you enter that, you'll be angry. Like certain emotional states where you can almost craft. It's ontological design, like with Frege's book. Like
yes, wonderful. Yes, like, absolutely. I love it. I love this implementation of the philosophy. It's way beyond my talents. I love it. I think it's great. Ontological design. My point with narratology is that narratology, by making narratology first philosophy, we explain why ontology, epistemology, and phenomenology cannot be reduced to each other. We explain why the three different domains of philosophy historically and why that makes sense. Then you can start play with how they relate to one another. Hegel does that with onto-epistemology. I tried to play with onto-phenomenology, discovered it was impossible, at least for me, it was absolutely impossible. But then I think logos and pathos are fundamentally so different, they're absolutely reducible to each other, and that is the real difference. The real difference is within that realm between logos and pathos, because therefore mythos is needed. But by never reducing anything except to one of those three poles, when anybody comes to the door and says, I am the truth, or I speak the truth, you got them say, you know what? Truth is always in pluralist. You are a truth at best. You can never be more than a truth. And that's incredibly, incredibly nice and revealing for you as a subject to understand that I could at best be in a state where I'm a truth. And that is what I call truth as an act. Not a truth as a fact. Truth as an act is in the subconscious. Truth as an act is when I'm interacting with the world intuitively, whereas truth as a fact is when I integrate that I acted, truth as an act, and therefore I look at the world and say that, okay, I acted truthfully, I was myself in that action, good, I can build on that, and I can remember that, virtualize it before I go into the next truth where I'm going to act as a truthful person. So I borrowed truth as an act from Bourdieu, but he never had truth as a fact, which is kind of irritating, and I realized that, well, truth as a fact is really, really good idea. I guess a virtual would be truth as a fantasy.
Right. I could keep going. I just don't want to hijack.
Okay. Why don't you come back later and then drop in like Ronaldo and we drop. Let somebody else.
Good.
Is Madalena there?
Amazing. All right. Worship time. And time is absolute. And so is death. And when I look at the landscape we're having to steer, let's talk cybernetics, it's steering, not necessarily knowing where we're going. It seems to me that the dominant paradigm, whether you call it Christian, Islamic, Abrahamic, whatever, is ubiquitously in death as unthinkable. I mean, that's been the condition. And I think that has literally gone into absolutely every system that we interact with and influences the way we can design, the way we can relate to each other. And this is where putting the death back into the relationality of our processual becoming begins to create the possibility for those extreme states to be integrated in a completely different way. Whereas the system that we navigate today is structurally stultifying. And this is where the monastic experience of retreating from the system has to be very well thought. And I'd like to add a question to you because I've been sort of enamored of this David McCarricker notion of time energy. And I think that relates to Andrew's question about the electric age, that it's time energy is repeatable blocks of energy infused time, because it's not just time, it's what kind of quality of time are we even able to access when we've been stultified into this deathless immediacy of sensation after sensation, and that an entire that childhood is being experienced through that stultification. And so I see the beauty of the ritual and the extremes, but if there isn't the capacity to actually create, and the discipline and the praxis of time energy as sort of a basic unit of this living beyond the size of the tribe. Okay, because that's really the question. I mean, if you go back to Zoroastrianism, you're talking about 15 million people on the planet, tops. And here we are, these pathetic mammals who have no hair, who have no fangs. We're extremely precarious. Well, we remain precarious because the same things kill us. Okay. But if you deny death, then you start organizing everything in a way that has a runaway loop.
But you read Deleuze, right? I'm thinking about capitalism and schizophrenia right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we discuss capitalism as a religion,
Mm-hmm.
it could even be a bit upfront here and called perfected Protestant Christianity is ultimate capitalism in a way. And capitalism doesn't die.
Exactly.
It's a ghost, it doesn't die. What it does is that it comes up to us as a ghost and grabs us by the collar and says, whatever is for sale, I'll have it. So it forces us to the point. This is kind of in between Protestant and Zufism. So this is great stuff, Madeleine, but it takes us to the point where it says that, okay, there are certain things in my life that are not for sale, and the name for those things is love. Because as any sex worker knows, sex is for sale, love is not. Love for sale is ironic. I can't sell love. You can't buy love. You can buy sex. You can buy sexual life. And that's what sex workers are brilliant at separating sex and love, and they're brilliant at separating these things, and that's why I love them for it. But the capitalism comes all the way up to us, and capitalism says, I'm eternal, I will never die. I'm now a ghost in society, and you cannot remove me, and I will survive you, which is almost like a matriarch in the sociant, in the sense that the matriarch comes up in the sociant and says, I rule, my wisdom rules, and I know what's best for you, and you're going to submit to me because I have no ego left. I personify the sociant itself, submit to me. Which is the beginning of religion, the matriarch. I've seen it, in Iboga ceremonies in Africa, when they got the cocky 19-year-old guy gets blown up by the Iboga. He's totally wrecked 3 days later, and that old woman comes up to him and says that, now you are nothing. Now you're submitted to me. Now you are yourself. So capitalism imitates that in a very cruel way. But it has a limit. It really has a limit. It has that limit when it says that I will have anything in your life which is not for sale. And then you can respond to capitalism by saying, there are things in my life that are not for sale, and they literally are not for sale. And then for those is love. That's what Badiou has written 2 books about love. It's exactly why. So that's the response. So what capitalism then does is that it throws itself into our faces all the time through sensations. It makes us addicted to these sensations. It does anything it can because it's a perfect environment for absolute development towards perfect addiction. The whole point with capitalism, schizophrenia, and Deleuze and Guattari was that they already wrote in the 1980s, before the internet even arrived, before we got addicted to the smartphones and everything. They basically predict everything. Is that capitalism will go all the way into an absolutely schizophrenic state, meaning that capitalism will imitate the matriarch so much all the way to its end state that it will take us over and make us addicts. So the world has become 8 billion smartphone addicts, right? And they're all addicted to sensations. Why? Because to survive in a nomadic state, in a jungle, you have to have an alert system that registers anything that is ambivalent. It's like the phenomenal state is ambivalent. Then you go into that potential state where you act. It's like you decide whether the ambivalent state is deeply problematic or not. You make it a priority. You either just memorize it, and then you drop it, but you still memorize it and have it in case something else happens, which is ambivalent. And once you've seen 3 ambivalences after one another that seem to be a pattern, you drop your entire worldview and jump into that phenomenological new worldview you construct out of a fantasy. Because it's better to construct a fantasy on the 3 failures rather than to try to hold on to your worldview. It's basically how phenomenology operates. It's not a try. So since we know that we live like that for millions of years, we lived in a world where we all had to register threats and fear and be fearful about things. Then that's used by capitalism to throw fear at us, which is sensational.
And anesthesia. Which is the bastard anesthesia,
Yes.
which, according to Whitehead, is the bastard substitute for peace.
Yeah, we're totally exhausted by it. Totally exhausted by it. So what you're saying here is an interesting hypothesis just pops up here, is that what is interesting when you say is that since Western society is incredibly oversaturated with these sensations and sensationalism, the proper attentionalism, which we're proposing, which is that I throw the sensations along a timeline and I value them, which is a conscious operation. That's what we're conscious of. To become conscious about that this is going on, instead of being stuck in your subconsciousness, where you're being plundered by these sensations all the time, you go into the conscious state and then start sorting out things, just say, even them out over time. And you have a longer perspective, which you can do with consciousness. You can say, over the last 3 months, oh my God, how many sensations I fell into. And they were just irrational. They were totally not meaningful. They had no value. So my value is now to not fall for the sensations. To do that, we retreat. We turn off. We're sick of the sensations, and we do it by building retreat centers. So Buddhism has now built over 600 Buddhist centers across Europe. Women have already changed their religion and switched from Christianity to Buddhism, which is incredibly sound, because you need to get away. And even Catholics and Protestants are at least going, to monasteries somewhere, whatever they do to meditate, just get away from the whole thing. So it's like the whole reaction is that away, turn off, no longer live with the sensations, rather try to practice a proper attentionalism. And attentionalism is to add the time axis to the sensation. That's like, the sensation means nothing if I didn't dream about it, if it wasn't something that I wanted to walk into, if it was forced on me, it has no value. And in my conscious operations afterward, if the sensation was like, what was that? Oh, okay, somebody threw that in my face. I got shocked by it. I was fearful. I lost the energy through the process. Like Whitehead said, there's no energy left in it. I'm sedated, which is the point with capitalism, to sedate people, to turn them into slaves of media, right? So if that's what happens, then why do I fall for the sensations? And then we see the tragedy around us. We see people everywhere getting addicted to sensations. And why? Because the sensation reminds them of them screaming as a baby, and they get access to the mamilla. The second you suck your mother's tit because you screamed is what you remember. And that is such a strong biological memory that capitalism plays into that. And capitalism tells you, if you just buy this product, if you buy this service, if you spend your money, then your mother's tit is back into your mouth and you can feel calm again. This is the lesson take of capitalism. It's way better than the traditional Marxist analysis, which was too exoteric, too Platonist. This is the true esoteric critique of capitalism, which means that let capitalism be, let it run its course. It has byproducts that are beneficial. You have tons of books behind you, all both of them probably. We can afford to buy a laptop and have these conversations in different countries. Capitalism has lots of benefits. We can just look at those and say those are still there. But we don't buy sensationalism. So in this way, attentionalism has its opposite finally. Maybe that's why when in 25 years I started digging into it. Certainly the Sufism book. Attentionalism is when sensations are forced to be valued along the time axis. They're no longer sensations in a now that they've kidnapped. They're now suddenly valued according to a hierarchy where we think of our entire lives all the way until the day we die. And from the moment we were born, birth is also an absolute, by the way. So we think all the way from we're born till we die, and therefore we value it according to that perspective. And by then valuing the sensation, we can realize the vast majority of sensations that are sent our way are totally useless to us.
I would like to just add this notion of the placenta, because that's the true mother. I mean, because without the placenta, the host body would kill the embryo.
We should just say that you and I are talking about Susan Gunner's fantastic concept of the placenta theory, which means that Lacanian theory is completed. The mother, like there is no other, there is no big other, there's also no mother. There's the placenta.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, how do you put, that's interesting. How do you put placenta theory into this? Because I find that incredibly interesting.
Well, first, it is for me, I mean, if we look at just how we use language, we call it Mother Nature, the motherland. I mean, that concept also permeates everything. And therefore, it starts to infect this worship of whether it's capitalism, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I like to call it the Vaticanization of everything, because the corruption of the good is the worst, elite.
Yeah.
So the placenta is temporary, just like the myth is temporary. Okay?
Brilliant.
Single use.
Susan will love you for this.
Single use. It's gone. It's created for that specific membranics of host and parasites, because we're all parasites as relational entities.
The embryo is indeterminate, the mother is determinate, the placenta is transdeterminate.
Exactly. And then you've got, I mean, I don't know how far I can get with this, but I've become curious with Michel Serres and his notion of umbilical thinking, and how it is such a slave to language, because he wants to enslave all other discourses. So post-umbilical uterine. I mean, uterine is universal for mammals, okay? So it always has that placenta, which would be the mythos, okay? And that mythos, I love what you came up with the subject being subconscious, because that's the only way the porosity can happen. Otherwise, you become rigid, and you're not in the interaction in which you actually are, because there's no such thing as not being in relation. And we're in this long tail from quantum physics that absolutely unsettled what was grounding this linear notion of time. Okay. And
and this is complete. We'll talk about tonight is completely relationalist philosophy in its full form, because by claiming the transdeterminate, the subconscious, the present, the mythos as the only thing that exists, that's precisely relational. It's 100% relational. The relata, which I think Alex Sibbert has misunderstood, the relata is basically the object as a byproduct of the relation. The relata is, of course, in consciousness. It's always in the past. The object is always located in the past. So the project is located in the future, the subject is located in the now, and the object is located in the past.
And this is why I really love Raven and Owen's project, as you know, I went nuts. Because mostly the humor, the absolute need to satirize intractable disagreements, because these have become intractable disagreements, and we go to fucking war over it. And that's become the default setting. And I heard you speaking about the whole thing about, men who are ready to die for the nation. Well, that's a Brahmic kind of move, because it's like, if you love God, sacrifice your own son. How does that become compatible with this new understanding of love? Because I think that needs to be reinvented, along with Rambo.
I'll stop you there. I'll stop you there and keep it there, maybe for the third session if you want to join, because there's also a fundamental the starting point for the book, which I might have to wreck. So I'm just saying that. That's why I'm having these discussions. But the fundamental starting point is that all attempts throughout civilization to change human beings from the biological programming are just cruel. Now, that is the case if it's biological to be willing to die for the sociant, then it should be respected. It might not happen. It's not the father killing the son. It's absolutely not. That's like, it is the enemy killing the son. It is really. But we can leave it at that. Then we can look at it, because anything where we try, it's very easy to go from the lust over to anarchism and say we should change human beings or allow them to change, but we really prefer them to change in a certain direction. That's why my philosophy is incredibly 100% descriptive and not prescriptive. Even my 90-year-old mother said the best thing she loves about my work is that I never try to change another human being. If anybody wants to change, they can change themselves. So I try to stay with that ethos throughout the work. It's also my work, and you're certainly this. Susan will love it. I love the idea of the placenta as the mythos, as the transdeterminate between the embryo and the mother. I mean, it just adds even more to psychoanalysis that was never there. It is, of course, women like you and Susan have come up with it. I made Susan read Julia Kristeva, and then she understood that women add tons of shit to psychoanalysis the men don't see. And this is definitely it. Definitely it. Yes. All right. Do we have any other questions out there, or anybody who wants to return to asking a question?
I just want to point out that Madalena was the only person that showed up at the discussion group, which is going to be this Saturday. So if you want to join us, me and Madalena, maybe she can perhaps lead the thing, and I can just listen, because quite an amazing array of voices here. Anyway. Does anybody have a last question or comment for Alexander? We've got like 5 minutes in our official time.
I know Tim is sharing stuff here that I haven't seen because I haven't opened that yet.
Yeah, I want to hear from Tim too.
Yeah.
Got anything to say, Tim?
Do I have anything? Sure. I was just posting some comparisons in regards to what makes us human and how people have thought about that. Just a little project trying to understand.
But you brought up the soul in your thing, so that might be like, this seems to belong to this in-between kind of thing that everybody.
But why don't we return to like 2 minutes of Sweeney versus Bart featuring Pickerel here?
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah.
I just confessed, Tim. I just confessed to Andrew tonight that I do understand the limitations of Zen Buddhism. I'm going to see how it is in Korea, because Joachim Lummer and I are going to Korea in May and going to visit Sion monasteries and things and see what we discover there. But
They
the
put the cart before the
infinite
horse.
now is lacking in Zen Buddhism, but it's obvious in Vajrayana. And of course, the infinite now is in Sufism, which probably lacks the peak experience. So we're returning to Tibet eventually as the only place where the peak experience and the infinite now have both coexisted.
Yeah. So two things. One thing with this list that I posted was just the difficulties of language and how we understand each other. And words like magic, mysticism, soul, mind are all very much confused. And that's one thing we very much need to address, especially in relating between, say, Vajrayana and Zen and Sufism. With Zen, they're putting the cart before the horse. There's you need to embody first and deal with your problems before you go into.
Well, maybe what you're saying, Tim, is like Vajrayana has all these stages of growth, and Zen you just jump right into the pot, right? And
exactly.
They do exist, but in Zen you're just going for the absolute. You're just whereas in Vajrayana you work on you work on your body, you work on your mind, you work on speech, you work on all these different aspects of experience before you approach the no thingness state and the infinite, right? Like
Zen comes from Dzogchen and Mahamudra stage, which is completion stage. And what if you got to generate and have some realization before you can get to the completion stage. That's the the main problem there.
Well, that's a whole other big discussion. Yeah, but for
Exactly.
sure, like that's something really worth. But anyway,
No, I agree. I've always found Zen philosophically incredibly attractive. And I'm a big fan of inside Zen as a practice, etc. But I wouldn't see it as my complete life. And I miss the psychedelics, let's put it that way. And this is why I was drawn to the Persian traditions where all those things existed. The Homa, the Persian dhyana is much more, it's much wider. And it appears the Tibetans actually are the ones that really inherited the Persian tradition when Islam took over Iran and became more distorted. But it's also existed underground, of course, within Sufism. And now when I talk to Sufism, just mention Zoroaster's Gathas, since that's now a very prominent text, people read it everywhere. I had this discussion with Sharon Vakili in Iran the other day. And they're all saying, yeah, it's obvious that the Gathas is the first Sufi text. It's nothing to do with the Quran whatsoever. So if you have that mentality to it, I think it's much closer to the Vajrayana traditions. I'd say Sufism is just a term that anybody can borrow, do the interpretation of, work with, whatever. I just found it incredibly useful because I'm interested in not so much inventing a new category as in finding the different ways into the different Eastern spiritual traditions, because I think these are the strongest esoteric traditions we know. And that's why I got interested in it. So, yeah.
And to complete that, I would throw in two words that are important: Tantra and yoga. Tantra to weave and yoga to yoke, which has to do with the embodied world and dealing with yourself, dealing with reality, being present, being aware. From there, you got to learn the rules before you can break them and before you can extend further.
Sure.
okay, it's 10 o'clock.
I do my best to make that into language and turn it into philosophy. Turi has a last
Any
question.
final words, Alexander?
Oh, Turi has the last question before we finish.
Turi has the last question. Okay.
Yes.
Quickly, please.
This is specifically on you, Andrew, and Tim. I was looking at two words which struck me, and that is Mantrayana and Vajrayana. And I know that they are used interwoven, like as if they are the same. But historically, when I look at the word Mantrayana, from my understanding, it comes before Vajrayana, before the definition of Vajrayana, which always included the body, specifically, as you just said, Tim, the yoking of the body. But the Mantrayana was more focused on a mantric practice, so it's more on the prayers, on the magic side of these things. So I was just curious what you think about this, because I find this difference very interesting, as Vajrayana being a complete system of including the Hinduistic yogic practices into the Mantrayana.
Yeah, I got a lot to say about that.
You answered it.
He answered it. I would say that
Yeah.
I would say that just quickly that don't follow the Tibetan system, because it became very rigid. Go back to India and Nepal, and they're more into the yogas and more into the body, and it's not such a systematic linear thing. This is what I was taught by my own teacher. He wants to go back to the Indian and the Persian and stay away from the Tibetan. Actually was quite, my own teacher said it was like Confucianism on steroids. It got very, very rigid in some ways.
That was the third influence, the problematic influence, I would say. Yeah.
So, there are great masters in Tibet and all that, but I think Mantrayana is just specifically related to the mantra practice, but you do a lot of things like physical stuff before you get into doing mantra deities, but there's all kinds of things. So you can't really make any blanket over generalizations about the tradition as a whole, because it's not like an assembly line. It's a very fluid and tradition.
I can see that.
The perfect ending. The perfect ending here is that anti-fragile, we've heard the term before. We're going to go anti-rigid, right? Yeah. I'm doing the weirdest thing ever. I'm trying to write a book on how to be as anti-dogmatic as possible. It's of course an absurdity, but I'm going to try. That's the whole point. How do you write a philosophical work on esotericism? When you say that this is beyond language, how do you write a fucking book about it? Well, I'm going to try at least. But the pointer is that anti-rigid is good because over time, when these exoteric influences become too many into the esoteric, what happens is it becomes rigid, rule-based, and it starts to imitate the very law that the esoteric was supposed to defend itself against. And that's when the esoteric has to retract, it has to redefine itself, it has to be reformed, it has to retreat to then come back into esotericism, to be a temporary mythos again until the esoteric starts invading it and tries to introduce laws. This is how you must do it. And every time I say this is how you must do it, you go into the rigidity.